"You don't belong here, Rachel. Let the men speak today." That was the first thing my father said to me in 12 years. No greeting, no handshake, no check on how the drive had been. Just those clipped even words right there on the courthouse steps. The morning was cold enough that my breath curled in front of me like a question mark, but his face was flat, unreadable. He didn't even look me in the eye, just stared out past the flagpole, where the colors hung heavy in the still Tennessee air. I had come home for the Veterans Tribunal, a special hearing to recognize service members from our county to give them a place to share their stories. A tradition, an honor. My name had been printed on the program Colonel Rachel Greene Joint Defense Cyber Liaison 22 years in. But you wouldn't have known it by the way he stood there guarding the doorway like a bouncer at a club where my name had never been on the list. I stayed still for a second, heels steady on the concrete, the morning sun catching the brass oak leaves on my collar. It was the same uniform I'd worn the day I took command, the same uniform I'd carried through 100 briefings, a dozen crises, an endless string of questions no one else wanted to answer. I swallowed once. "Morning, Dad," I said. He didn't answer, didn't even shift. Just nodded once sharp and dismissive, as if that was permission enough to cross the threshold. I stepped inside. The county courthouse hadn't changed. Still the same scuffed linoleum floors, still the smell of burnt coffee and polished wood, still the ancient portraits of local judges lining the walls. As a kid, I'd followed Dad here on veterans parades, helping him carry boxes of medals and programs. Back then, I'd believed the building was built to hold heroes. Now, I wasn't sure if it could even hold the truth. They had decorated the hallway with banners honoring our fighting sons. Sons. Always sons. The wording made my ribs go tight like a belt cinched one notch too far. Ahead, I saw my brother Mark already in his dress blues, telling some old story to a group of men who were nodding and laughing. Mark with his perfect posture and the kind of charm that never bent under pressure, like he'd been born to hold the floor. He caught my eye. For a split second, I saw a flicker of uncertainty, and then his grin returned, professional, polished. "Rachel," he called too loudly as if performing. "Glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," I told him, even though the words tasted like metal. He moved in for a quick side hug, then turned right back to his circle. I stood there, hands folded, taking in the place the people. There were rows of folding chairs, a homemade sheet cake in patriotic colors on a side table, a slideshow looping photos of uniformed men, helmets, flak jackets, medals. No women. No me. Someone brushed past with a polite "excuse me," bumping my shoulder. I stepped aside, suddenly aware of how my uniform seemed to scrape against their expectations. I made my way to a corner near the refreshment table, scanning for a familiar face. Aunt June spotted me, lifting a paper plate, eyes soft with something like apology. "Rachel," she called, "you look so sharp in that uniform." "Thanks," I said. She dropped her voice, leaning close. "Don't let him get to you. You earned your place." I smiled thinly. "I know. But did I?" Because the moment I stepped back into this town, the same scripts started playing. Dad's voice in my head all those years, hammering the same lesson: "Rachel, don't talk over the men. Don't push. Don't correct them. Just do your job quietly and stay in the back." Back then, I'd obeyed. I'd nodded, I'd shrunk, I'd stayed small. Now, I didn't think I could shrink, even if I tried. Across the room, a younger woman in civilian clothes caught my eye. Her hair was tied back, a volunteer name tag pinned crooked on her sweater. She looked at me with something close to hope, or maybe curiosity. I gave a small nod, and she smiled shyly before looking away. I wondered if she'd ever been told to stay quiet, too. The program started late, the old judge tapping the mic until it squealed. The noise jolted me like a shot fired too close. I found a seat in the back row, perfectly positioned to see the entire stage, and perfectly positioned to be ignored. Dad took the podium first. His voice was still strong, still commanding. "Welcome," he said. "Today, we remember what it means to serve." I waited for him to glance my way, to acknowledge me. He didn't. He praised my brother, of course. Mark's medals, Mark's deployments, Mark's leadership. The crowd nodded, all familiar with the story of the local boy who made good. When he finished, polite applause rose and fell. Then he cleared his throat. There will be testimonies. Let's keep them respectful, he added. Remember, this is a day for the men who fought. The men. I felt the weight of every year that word had been wielded like a shield to push me aside. I shifted forward in my chair spine, straight. I hadn't come to make a scene. I hadn't come to fight. But I had come to be seen because my mother had believed once quietly in the kitchen while scrubbing dishes that I could stand beside any of them, that I could hold my own. And even if she was gone, that truth was still alive in me. So when the next name was called and Dad turned to look right past me, I took a breath, let it fill every corner of my ribs, and reminded myself why I'd put on the uniform in the first place. Not to please him, but to lead. When I was a kid, I thought my father was carved out of granite. He stood taller than anyone, voice booming, every order sharp and certain. The kind of man you'd never think to question, because he made even mistakes sound like strategy. People around here adored him. Vietnam vet local councilman, the type who kept his boots polished long after retirement. When he walked into the American Legion on Saturday afternoons, they'd stand and call him Major Greene, like no time had passed. He was the first person to teach me how to lace combat boots, the first person to take me to a Memorial Day ceremony, the first person to look straight through me while praising my brother. Mark was the golden child. Captain Airborne, the one who came home with stories of jump school and ranger tabs, the one who let Dad retell every single mission like gospel. Me. I was the one who talked too much, who asked too many questions, who couldn't leave well enough alone. I still remember being 14, sitting on the staircase while Dad and Mark stood in the living room talking about the Army as if it were some exclusive club. I'd said I want to join too. Dad barely glanced my way. Rachel, don't be ridiculous. They'll never let you lead. You'd be better as a nurse. Or a teacher. That line cut. Even after I signed my ROTC papers, even after I shipped off to my first assignment, he never took it seriously. To him, I was playing soldier, pretending, dressing up. The letters I mailed home came back barely acknowledged. When Mom would call, she'd pass the phone to Dad, and he'd ask about my unit with the same tone he used for weather reports. Mild curiosity, nothing more. Stay quiet, he'd always remind me. Let the men talk. Sometimes I wondered if he meant men or Mark, because it seemed like Mark had inherited the family legacy in one easy sweep. I was the spare the second act no one stayed to watch. I had thought, maybe just maybe, with enough time and enough rank, Dad would finally see me, that he'd hear my voice without dismissing it. So I built my name, quietly, relentlessly. I volunteered for the worst deployments. I worked the late shifts, took the difficult assignments, coordinated more operations than anyone wanted to keep track of. I learned the language of satellites, drone strikes, and black zones, until the protocols felt like a second skin. And somewhere along the way, they put oak leaves on my shoulders. Colonel, a promotion I'd worn with pride but not surprise. I had earned it. Still, it wasn't enough for him. Because boots on the ground mattered to Dad. The grit under your nails, the sweat, the scars. To him, war was mud, not fiber optic lines or code structures or electronic kill switches. He couldn't see that sometimes you saved people by pressing the right key, not pulling the right trigger. I carried that frustration with me every time I came home, though I tried to bury it. Like today. I sat in the courthouse folding chair, watching Mark tell stories to a group of retirees in starched khakis. They laughed easily, drawn to him like moths. Dad stood nearby, one hand on Mark's shoulder, pride practically beaming off him. It hurt. It shouldn't have, but it did. Because I had 1,000 stories of my own. Missions that stayed quiet, because they had to missions that would never make a banner headline, but changed everything just the same. Like the time a power station was days from sabotage, and my team found the exploit buried in a third-party app no one even checked. Or the night a drone swarm over an Allied airfield was neutralized because I redirected the entire command system before the software collapse. They wouldn't put those stories on a slideshow. Too technical, too hidden, too complicated to explain in a room full of men who still judged courage by how much dirt you wore on your boots. A voice called my name, breaking me from the thought. Rachel Greene. I turned. It was a woman in uniform, an Air Force captain, fresh-pressed, anxious. Yes, she swallowed. Colonel Greene? Right, I read one of your reports at a joint conference last year. I just wanted to say. Her voice shook, but she stood tall. It meant a lot to see your name. Ma'am? For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Then I smiled, small but real. Thank you, Captain. She nodded, her shoulders relaxing, then hurried back toward the seating rows. Dad had seen it. I could feel his eyes on me, but when I looked over, he turned away, jaw set, like he was closing a door. The old script still held, stay quiet. Let the men talk. I folded my hands, watching, as a color guard lined up near the flag. The program was about to start. I had come here for Mom to stand in her place, to remember the service she'd supported, the sons she raised, the daughter she tried to protect. Part of me wanted to stand up and leave, to walk out and never come back, never give him another chance to cut me down. But something rooted me to the chair. Because no matter what Dad said, no matter what this town whispered behind its flags and parades, I had a place here. I was tired of letting them pretend I didn't. My hands rested on my thighs, steady as the national anthem played. And deep inside, I promised myself if the chance came, I would speak, even if he hated me for it. My first command felt like standing on a fault line. I was 26, barely out of the safety net of field assignments, still carrying a duffel that smelled like barracks soap. They handed me a platoon of tech specialists, signals, comms, drone pilots, and told me to keep them from falling apart. Nobody said good luck, but they might as well have. The briefing tent reeked of stale coffee and anxiety. There was a power struggle simmering between two senior NCOs before I even zipped up my jacket that first morning. My second in command, a grizzled sergeant who looked like he'd been in uniform since Vietnam, barely glanced at my rank. Ma'am? He'd said so flat I could hear the unspoken prove it. So I did. I sat with my troops' boots in the same mud helmet dented from the same rucksacks. I learned their personal histories, who missed a daughter's birthday, who carried a worry about a mother's cancer back home, who lied about a sore knee to stay on the mission. They weren't numbers to me. They were mine. And the first time something went sideways, a blackout during a live fire data relay, a local network going dead, just as the mission feeds kicked in, I didn't panic. I remembered a lesson from school from a tiny systems textbook no one bothered to open. System fails are predictable if you study their pressure points. So I got on the floor, literally on my knees, and checked every cable run, barked commands into the dark, and when I found the melted adapter that had shorted the comms, I replaced it with a backup from my own pack. The feed came back. Mission saved. No casualties. I had 100 other moments like that over the next 2 years. My name started moving through back channels. Colonel Greene doesn't break under pressure. Colonel Greene knows the kill chain like she wrote it. Colonel Greene doesn't lose people. Except at home, none of that made it through. Dad still called once every few months, but the conversations always curled back into the same script. How's Mark, he'd ask. I'd answer patient, even though Mark and I barely crossed paths. And you? Rachel, fine, sir. Still working computers. Something like that? All right, stay safe. Click. It took years before I realized he wasn't going to change. His world had limits, and I had stepped outside them so far I might as well have been on another planet. So I made peace with being uninvited to his pride. I built my own. My teams, my deployments, the chain of soldiers who trusted me to make the right call even when higher headquarters wavered. And in that, I found something steadier than Dad's old war stories. I found respect. Respect is quiet. It doesn't cheer in parades, doesn't show up on Facebook photos. It sits inside you, solid and earned. When I pinned on full colonel, I felt the weight of every moment I'd carried alone, every dismissal, every raised eyebrow, every "that's not for you" I'd ever heard. I wore those oak leaves like armor. But coming home, nothing had shifted. As I sat in that community center, the walls draped with red, white, blue bunting, Dad's voice echoing through the room, I felt like I was 14 again. Like all those years in uniform had evaporated the second I crossed the county line. They called Mark up to say a few words. He had the easy confidence of someone who had never had to defend his place at the table. He spoke about tradition, about duty, about men who shaped him. No mention of me? After he came by my folding chair, still half smiling as if we were teammates on some family scoreboard. Don't take it personal, he told me, like a consolation prize. This is just, the old crowd. I know, I said, even though it stung. He lowered his voice, trying to soften the blow. They don't get the cyber stuff. They never will. My voice stayed calm. It's not for them to get. He hesitated, as if hearing something new in my tone, then patted my shoulder awkwardly before drifting away. My gaze shifted to the side table, where the programs were stacked. Honoring the Greene men, it read across the top in blocky print. My name was there, small, misspelled. Colonel Rachel Greene, spelled like the sitcom character. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I folded the program in half, smoothed its crease, and put it in my pocket. A receipt in case I ever needed to remind myself how far I'd come. The old judge called for the next segment, testimonies. Anyone who had served was invited to stand and speak, share a story, a lesson. My father leaned back in his chair, voice low, warning. Don't start, Rachel, he said. Let the men have their say. I kept my eyes on the stage. Because someday, I knew they would all run out of stories. And then maybe finally, someone would want to hear mine. The courthouse felt smaller than I remembered. I'd sat here once as a kid on a field trip, my feet swinging above the wooden bench, bored, while the county clerk droned on about civic duty. It hadn't meant anything then. It meant everything now. The benches were packed. Veterans in all shades of uniform lined the pews. Young Marines in dress blues, old men with weather-creased faces and jackets too small for their shoulders. On the stage, a local lawyer stepped to the mic, fumbling with his stack of notes. His voice trembled as he began reading off the docket a list of commendations, citations, a couple of procedural updates. Then he reached the name that made me sit up. Lance Corporal Javier Ortega. He read, squinting at the paper. Here today, regarding a disciplinary matter. A hush moved through the room like a sudden breeze. I watched the young Marine stand rigid, his dress blues impossibly starched, the ribbons on his chest gleaming. Barely 20, if that. Dark circles under his eyes. I'd seen that look before in 100 kids under my command. The look that meant I did everything right, but someone still wants to bury me. The lawyer stammered on trying to summarize the case. Something about failure to follow proper handoff procedures, unauthorized code access, potential security breach. Except that made no sense. I'd read enough after-action reports in my lifetime to smell a scapegoat. I shifted forward in my seat. My father next to me saw it instantly. Rachel, he hissed under his breath. Don't! I didn't answer. The lawyer went on talking about how the Marine had disrupted chain of command by executing a data protocol on his own initiative. I frowned. That initiative probably saved lives. I'd seen that exact scenario play out in real time. But nobody on that stage seemed to care. They were going to strip this kid of his record. Dishonorable. Career-ending. I could feel the young Marine's heart beating from 20 feet away. Dad leaned closer, voice low and commanding. Stay out of this, he warned. Let the men handle it. I stared ahead, refusing to react. The lawyer tried to continue, but he was drowning in acronyms he didn't understand. He tripped over every third sentence, glancing back at the judge for help. That judge, a retired Navy JAG officer turned civilian magistrate, was no fool. His eyes swept the room, looking for anyone who might know what was actually going on. They landed on me. Colonel Greene, he said, his voice level, but curious. I believe you have some background in these matters. My father stiffened like someone had punched him. I didn't stand yet. I didn't want to embarrass anyone, not the lawyer, not my family, not the young Marine trying to hold himself together. But that voice in my head, my mother's voice, was stronger. If you know the truth, Rachel, you owe it to say it. I rose slowly, heels clicking against the linoleum. Yes, Your Honor, I said. I have experience with Cyber Defense Command integration and emergency override procedures. My father's head turned so fast, I thought he might snap something. Sit down, he hissed. You'll humiliate us. I ignored him. The judge nodded. Then please, step forward. I moved past Dad without another glance. Past Mark, who looked away, suddenly busy, smoothing his sleeve. Past the rows of men who'd spent their whole lives assuming I was just a polite shadow at family gatherings. The young Marine's eyes caught mine. Wide, scared, grateful. I gave him the smallest nod. The podium felt warm from the last speaker's nervous hands. I took a breath, centering my voice, letting it fill the room. Your Honor. I began with respect. The procedure this Marine followed is standard emergency response under Defense Cyber Directive 23.4 paragraph 7. The language you're referencing, unauthorized protocol shift, does not apply in a hot environment with comms blackout and kinetic assets in the area. I paused, scanning the audience. Most didn't understand, but they heard the certainty. I went on. In plain terms, sir, this Marine acted within rules of engagement. He showed initiative under a partial systems collapse. He deserves a commendation, not a reprimand. A whisper ran through the pews. The lawyer's mouth opened and closed, no sound coming out. Dad was stone still. The judge leaned back, thoughtful. Colonel, he said you're confident of that. I nodded once. I'd stake my bars on it. Another hush. The judge tapped his gavel softly. I will adjourn for 5 minutes while I verify the directive. Please remain, Colonel Greene. I stepped back, meeting the Lance Corporal's eyes again. He looked like he might cry. I'd been him once, standing alone, waiting for anyone to say I see you. As I turned to leave the podium, I passed Dad. His face was pale with a kind of horrified disbelief, like he didn't know this version of me. For the first time, I didn't care. Because I wasn't going to let them steamroll another kid for the sake of a neat family story. I wasn't going to shrink. Not anymore. 5 minutes can feel like an hour when the air is thick with someone else's disappointment. I waited near the side wall while the judge conferred quietly with a clerk. My father refused to look at me. Mark tried to catch my eye, but I didn't give him the satisfaction. People were whispering. Some had started shifting uncomfortably in their seats, glancing back and forth between me and the young Marine, who still stood straight-backed at the defense table. He was doing what he'd been taught. Stand tall, show no fear. But I could see the small tremor in his shoulders. I'd seen it before, the moment when your faith in the chain of command is 1 second from breaking. My hands were steady. The judge finally returned, gavel in hand. His voice carried the clipped finality of a man used to sorting truth from rumor. I have reviewed the relevant directive, he said, nodding at me once with a measure of respect that I'd felt so rarely in rooms like this. Colonel Greene is correct. The protocol in question was fully within established emergency measures. A sound like air escaping a balloon filled the benches. The lawyer cleared his throat, fumbling with his papers. Your Honor, if I might? The judge cut him off with a glance. Counselor, please sit. He turned to the Marine. Lance Corporal Ortega, this tribunal recognizes your courage and quick thinking under a live threat scenario. There will be no dishonorable discharge. In fact, I will be forwarding a commendation request to your commanding officer. The kid's eyes went wide, his mouth parting like he might say something. Then he caught himself swallowing hard, nodding. I exhaled. Dad was glaring at me now, his jaw locked. Mark's face was a tangle of relief and confusion. But the judge wasn't done. Colonel Greene, he continued, since you clearly have a grasp of the technical details, here I would appreciate your assistance on the panel for the remainder of these hearings. It was so quiet, I could hear the ancient courthouse clock ticking overhead. I met the judge's eyes, calm, solid. It would be my honor, sir, I replied. Very good. He gestured to a chair near the bench, the kind of chair you offered to someone who'd earned it. As I crossed the floor, I heard Dad mutter under his breath, low enough that only I caught it. Why can't you just sit down and let the men speak? But I didn't stop. I took that seat on the panel, folded my hands in my lap, and felt something settle in my chest like a puzzle piece, finally clicking into place after years of being forced the wrong way. Because this was mine. They moved on to the next case, a routine benefits appeal, and the judge asked if I'd review a notation. I read it, offered a clear summary, and watched the lawyer nod with relief. A dozen eyes tracked me the entire time. At first, it burned that old reflex, the suspicion that they'd pick me apart waiting for me to slip. But then I realized they were listening. Really listening. For the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting to be heard. I was being invited. It rattled my father. I could see that plain as day. Each time I spoke, his mouth tightened, his arms folding tighter across his chest. I recognized that look, the way he'd stared at me when I was 10, and trying to argue why girls should be allowed to do the same chores as boys. He couldn't believe I'd grown past him, past his rules. Part of me ached, because once upon a time I had needed him to be proud. But not anymore. A break was called for lunch, and I stood to stretch. The courthouse emptied fast, people anxious to gossip in the parking lot. As I headed for the exit, I felt a hand on my sleeve. It was the young Marine Ortega, looking more like a kid in that moment than a soldier. "Ma'am?" he said, voice shaking. "Thank you. Nobody ever." "You don't owe me anything," I told him gently. "Just pay it forward. One day, there will be someone else in your boots, and they'll need you to stand up." His eyes went glassy, but he nodded. "Understood, ma'am." I squeezed his shoulder lightly, then let him go. In the hallway, Mark was waiting. He tried to joke, tried to smile, but it didn't land. "You really stole the show in there," he said. I met his gaze steady. "I didn't come to steal anything. I came to make it fair." He opened his mouth, closed it again, then sighed. "You know Dad's never going to forgive you for that." I shrugged. "I don't need his forgiveness." Mark shook his head, wonder in his expression. "You really mean that?" "Yeah," I said, letting the truth ring out in me. "I really do." Outside, the air was brighter, almost painfully clear. I took a deep breath, letting the cold settle my nerves. My father stepped out after us, catching up, his voice sharp. "Rachel!" That was out of line. I turned to face him. "No." "Dad," I said, calm as steel. That was in line. That was exactly where I belong. His jaw twitched. "These people don't need you lecturing them. They needed facts, and I gave them facts." He looked so frustrated, so small for a moment, that I felt a sting of pity. But I wouldn't shrink to make him comfortable anymore. He tried again, grasping at the last of his control. "You made me look foolish," he snapped. I shook my head slowly. "No, Dad. You did that to yourself." He flinched as if I'd hit him. Mark stood awkwardly to the side, his hands jammed in his pockets. "You going back in?" he asked me. "Of course," I said. Because I wasn't done. Because there were more names on that docket, more stories being twisted, more kids who might stand alone unless someone stepped in. I wasn't about to let the quiet swallow them. The judge called us back to order, voice echoing through the marble hall. I turned from my father, lifted my chin, and walked back in my boots, loud and sure, against the tile. And this time, nobody dared tell me to hush. When I took my seat at the panel again, the mood had changed. It was subtle, the shift of shoulders, the slight softening around the eyes of the veterans in the pews, the quiet hush when I spoke. They were seeing me now, not just a daughter of not just a support officer, but a leader. The next case was a benefits review for a reservist with a medical discharge. The lawyer stumbled through a description of PTSD claims, mumbling jargon that made my skin crawl. I leaned forward, voice steady. "Excuse me, counselor," I interrupted. "Could you clarify the criteria you used for the denial recommendation?" He blinked, then fumbled with his folder. "Well, if the codes weren't consistent." I held up a hand. Calm, professional. "Which codes exactly?" He stammered, rifling through his papers. The judge nodded to me. "Colonel, do you wish to review the file?" "Yes, sir," I answered and reached for the packet. My fingers skimmed the familiar forms, the 214, the medical evaluations, the fragmented notes from a behavioral health officer, clearly overworked and undersupported. I recognized the pattern immediately. Someone had cherry-picked the language to look non-combat related, so the benefits could be slashed. My blood ran cold. Your Honor! I began, my voice ringing through the chamber. The applicant's notes reference exposure to a targeted IED attack, along with documented secondhand trauma from casualty processing. That is a combat-related stressor. Silence. The reservist, a young woman with a pinched face and two thin wrists, lifted her eyes to me, hope flickering. I kept going. I recommend a full reconsideration with supporting statements from her unit leadership. And if they can't locate the original medic who signed the initial form, I have contacts at the Veterans Health Office who can help trace it. The judge nodded again, decisive. Motion to reconsider is granted. The reservist broke down in tears right there, her hands shaking. The lawyer tried to object, but fell quiet when the judge shot him a glare that could peel paint. I sat back, breathing evenly, letting the room catch up. Dad hadn't moved. His face looked carved from stone, pale and stricken. I wondered if he saw finally the shape of what I had become. Not loud, not angry, but unstoppable. They moved through another couple of routine recognitions, handing out certificates to the local men who had deployed with the Guard. The applause felt polite, almost distracted now. So many eyes kept sliding back to me, wondering what I might say next. I didn't seek that attention, but I didn't shrink from it either. When a break was called, I stepped outside to get some air. The winter sun had slipped behind the courthouse flag, casting a long shadow that made the sidewalk look cut in half. Mark followed me out. He stood awkwardly for a moment, then blurted, "You know, I've never seen Dad like that." I turned to him, waiting. He swallowed. "I mean, so off balance. You threw him off." I sighed. "Mark, I didn't come here to break him. I came here because Mom would have wanted me to stand up." He looked away, shame crossing his face. "I should have spoken up for you. All these years. I didn't." I studied him, my brother, who had grown so used to being the firstborn hero. "I don't blame you," I told him honestly. "You only played the part they gave you. Same as me." "But you changed yours," he said quietly. I nodded. "Yeah? I changed mine." For a moment, we just stood there. The sounds of the small town around us, a dog barking the rattle of an old pickup down Main Street, a wind chime from somewhere up the block. Mark shifted his weight. "If you want me to, I can stand up there with you next time." I smiled, small and real. "That's up to you, Mark, but I don't need it." He blew out a breath. "That's what scares me, I think." We went back inside together. The next testimony was scheduled, but before the speaker began, the judge cleared his throat. "I would like to take a moment," he said, glancing at me, "to acknowledge Colonel Greene's contributions here today. Her expertise has served this tribunal with distinction." A smattering of applause followed, uncertain but sincere. I didn't stand, didn't wave. I just inclined my head, accepting it. Dad scowled, arms crossed so tight, I wondered if he'd leave a bruise on himself. And for the first time, I didn't feel smaller under that look. The final case came forward, a dispute over burial honors for a National Guard soldier whose paperwork had been lost in a flood. His widow had been fighting for years to have him recognized, traveling county to county with a folder of faded documents. I took a steady breath. "Ma'am," I said to her gently, "may I look at the originals?" Her eyes shone. "Please, Colonel." I laid the yellowed certificates on the table, reading the water-blurred ink line by line. I spotted an old serial number partly visible and cross-referenced it in my memory. "I think I can help," I told her. The judge's eyes met mine. He gave a tiny nod like a commander acknowledging another. In that moment, I saw clearly I had become the thing Dad never imagined for me. Not a sidekick, not a footnote, but a force. One more soldier, no one else would protect one more voice that deserved to be heard, and I would give it oxygen. For the rest of the afternoon, I served on that panel, reviewing, clarifying, correcting. And one by one, I felt the shift in the room. They had come expecting me to be a polite daughter. They were leaving knowing I was a colonel. And nothing would put me back in that box again. When the hearing finally ended, the judge rose from his seat, voice calm but certain. "That concludes today's business. On behalf of the panel," he said, pausing deliberately, "and Colonel Greene's expert contributions, we thank you for your presence." It was quiet then, that deep, respectful hush that sometimes means more than applause. I stood straightening my uniform, letting the moment settle over me. Around me, I saw faces I'd grown up with. People who used to pinch my cheeks, call me Rachie, or nod politely but never quite listen. Now they watched me with something different, a mix of shock, respect, and maybe a hint of regret. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile even. I just let the weight of all those years of being silenced burn away. Dad didn't come over right away. He lingered near the flag display talking to another veteran, but his voice was subdued, his posture uncertain. I stepped out into the hallway. The winter sun had dropped behind the courthouse's brick walls, casting everything in a soft, golden glow that made the air feel fragile. I didn't rush. I walked slow, like each step was a final act of reclaiming my own story. Mark caught up with me on the steps. "Hey," he said. "Hey." He shifted awkward, then tried a half grin. "You were incredible in there." I shrugged. It was overdue. He nodded solemn. "Yeah, it was." For a second, neither of us spoke. It felt like we were children again, waiting for the school bus, side by side, trying to guess who'd get a gold star that day. Mark swallowed. He's rattled." "Yeah," I said, not even trying to soften it. "He should be." "He doesn't know how to handle you like this," Mark admitted. "Like an equal." I let that sink in. "Well," I finally replied, "he doesn't have to handle me at all." Mark exhaled almost a laugh. "Fair." He reached out, then hesitated, then laid a hand on my shoulder. It felt steadier than it had in years. "Proud of you, Rach," he said. "That one landed." I let it in. "Thanks," I answered. He left then, slipping away toward his car, leaving me alone on the steps. I stood there a while, just breathing, letting the cold night air fill my lungs. Then Dad emerged. He didn't speak right away, just walked over with that same rigid posture that had once seemed so unbreakable. Now up close, it looked tired. "Rachel," he began, voice flat. "Dad." He searched my eyes for something, forgiveness maybe, or permission to reset the clock. But I wasn't interested in erasing what happened. He tried again. "You blindsided me in there." I didn't blink. "No, Dad. I told the truth. That's all." He rubbed a hand over his chin. "That was not your place." I took a breath slow even. "It's always been my place," I said. "You just refused to see it." His mouth opened then shut. Around us, the courthouse was nearly empty. The flag fluttered on the pole above, steady even in the shifting wind. "You embarrassed me," he finally managed, voice raw. I met his gaze head on. "No, Dad. You embarrassed yourself by ignoring me for 20 years. A long silence. He looked so much older then, every year of disappointment carved into the lines around his mouth. "I was trying to protect you," he muttered so low I almost missed it. I tilted my head. "Protect me from what? From being better than you? From being seen?" He flinched. "From hurting your brother?" he said, almost like a confession. Mark needed to feel important. I let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped since childhood. "So you stepped on me to lift him up," I said, voice sharp but steady. He had no answer. I thought about pressing harder, about throwing every bitter memory in his face, but it felt hollow, like feeding a fire that was already ashes. Instead, I nodded once final. "That was your choice," I said. And this, I gestured back toward the courthouse, was mine. He swallowed hard. For a second, I thought he might break, say, sorry, reach out, beg, to start over. But he didn't, and I was done waiting. "Goodbye, Dad," I said, simply turning away. "Rachel." I paused, looked back. "Yeah." His mouth moved, but no words came. I didn't rescue him from the silence. I just walked down the courthouse steps, steady and whole. At the curb, the same young Marine I'd defended stood waiting. "Ortega." "Colonel," he said, snapping to attention. I smiled, tired but proud, at ease. He relaxed, shoulders dropping. "Thank you again, ma'am." I nodded. "You earned it." He hesitated, then added, "You made me believe I can actually belong here." I let those words warm something in me that had been frozen for so long. That's the point, I told him. Don't forget it. I watched him head off toward his car, a little taller, a little stronger. And I realized that was why I was here. Not to change Dad, but to break the pattern. To make sure the next kid, the next me, wouldn't have to stand alone. I headed toward my rental keys in hand. I was leaving in the morning, back to my assignment. Another rotation, another slate of soldiers who would count on me, whose stories I would help protect. As I reached for the car door, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered. Colonel Greene, a woman's voice asked. Crisp, confident. Yes, this is Greene. This is General Simmons' Joint Defense Liaison Office. I watched the tribunal stream. We'd like you to consider a senior advisory position at the Pentagon. I let the moment wash over me. Of course they were watching. Of course they saw what Dad never could. When would you like to discuss? I asked. Tomorrow morning, if possible. Copy that. I hung up, slid the phone back into my pocket, and sat behind the wheel. The courthouse glowed in my mirrors, a faint halo of civic pride. I didn't need to stand there anymore, waiting for a handshake that would never come. I had my own mission, my own voice, my own name. I drove away down Tulane Road, the streetlights flickering over the hood of my car, my heart steady. And for the first time, I realized I had stopped apologizing, stopped explaining, stopped asking permission. I was done with the half-life of someone else's legacy. I was ready to write my own. Tomorrow they could call me Colonel or Ma'am or even just Rachel. But they would never again call me Silent. That was mine to keep. And I would carry it forward, one voice stronger, one truth louder than any old wall of medals ever could.